Welcome back to the Talking Archive. My name is Josh Jacobs. I can also be found on Instagram at JoshDJ57. Would love to have you follow me there. And we got some cool videos there as well. And also subscribe to this YouTube channel also to get frequent updates about when we have new interviews. And our conversation continues with Dave Berg, longtime producer of The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. Who was your favorite guest to book on Tonight?
Well, there actually were two, and then it's the same as Jay's favorites.
Mm-hmm.
One is John F. Kennedy Jr., and the other is John Glenn.
The great astronaut and senator.
Yes, and presidential candidate.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah. So, which would you prefer, John Kennedy Jr.?
Yeah, let's talk about both of them, actually.
Okay.
About what stood about both of them.
Well, first of all, again, we have to go back in the time machine to understand what JFK Jr. meant to the American people back in the day. He represented like nobody else at the time, or maybe since that time either. He represented American royalty. He was from the Kennedy family.
Mm-hmm.
And he was handsome, just like his dad, and he was likable, and he wasn't a partisan. In fact, he had a political magazine, George.
That's right, yeah.
Very, it didn't do that well, but it was a wonderful magazine. And I remember one of my favorites, the cover of the magazine featured Charles Barkley dressed up like George Washington. And it was just wonderful. And so it was always my goal to book JFK Jr. And he just, every time I reached out, I couldn't. They always said, well, we're interested. They never say no. They always say, we'll think about it. Well, I kept trying for 6 years. It took me 6 years to book JFK Jr. And I just... I went through George magazine first because I figured he needs to promote his magazine. It's not doing well.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing happened. Nothing happened. One day when I called his assistant, Rosemary, I remember her name. Rosemary answered the phone, and I told her who I was and why I was calling, and she said, "Oh, I love the Tonight Show. I love Jay." And I thought, I'm not calling George Magazine ever again. I'm just going to go through her.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of formed a relationship where I would call her every so often, maybe once a month, and she would call me, and I would tell her all the Hollywood gossip, and she would tell me all the gossip in Washington. And then I would always say, hey, if your boy ever changes his mind, we want him on the show. Jay wants him on the show. And then, one day Jay said, let me make the call, right? So Jay called, right, and said, I really would love to have JFK Jr. on. She told JFK Jr., and finally he agreed to do it. He finally agreed after 6 years.
Wow.
And he had a couple of conditions. Number one, he was only available on one date. And number two, we couldn't promote his appearance. Well, if you can't, in television, if you can't promote something, you're dead in the water. Half of what you do is promote.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So Jay goes, what do you mean we can't promote his? How do we do this? And finally Jay said, I know. We'll call him the Great Mystery Guest. And so that's how we promoted his appearance for like 2 weeks out.
Oh, smart.
On the Tonight Show in 2 weeks, the Great Mystery Guest. So anyway, I checked our available dates, and on the one date he was available, we had already booked Jerry Seinfeld on the date of the very last Jerry Seinfeld show.
Oh, man.
So it's like, okay, I can't bump Jerry Seinfeld, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Jerry is booked as the first guest out, which is a big prestigious thing. You know, you always want to be the first guest.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a celebrity, if you're booked as the second guest and you're a big celebrity, that's an insult. That's an insult in Hollywood. So here I am with JFK Jr., and it's like, okay, we have an available date, but I have to tell him he's going to be second out to Jerry Seinfeld. So I get on the phone and I say, John, I got great news, really good news. The date you want to do our show, we have the date open. He goes, awesome. And I said, but I just want to tell you, Jerry Seinfeld is booked on that show because it's his last show if he's booked as the first guest. And there's this long pause, and John says, oh, well, I can't do the show then. I said, no, John, believe me, trust me, you are going to get, our ratings are going to be through the roof. They are going to be through the roof. Don't worry about ratings, and don't worry that you're not the first guest, because it's going to be one of the highest rating show we ever had. And he said, no, you don't get it. How can I follow someone like Jerry Seinfeld? Who cares about me? The guy was so humble. That's why I couldn't get him for 6 years. He didn't think anybody would care about him. And I said, can you just trust me that this is going to work? I'm telling you it's going to work. He goes, nah, I don't think I can do it. I said, I can't do it. So he drops out, right? So the first thing I did, I called Rosemarie, and she said, I'll work on him. So the next day he calls and said, okay, I'll do it. But I'll only do it on one condition. I said, okay, what condition is it now? He said, the one condition is I know nobody's going to have any interest in me, so you can only ask me questions about Jerry Seinfeld, because then people will listen. I said, how many questions can we ask you about Jerry Seinfeld? And he said, well, I didn't know it at the time, but he had been the subject of an entire Jerry Seinfeld show. He never made an appearance, but the show was about JFK Jr. So he said, trust me, I can make that. I'll make that into a story. I'll make it into a story. So he agrees to do the show, and the day of the show, he comes out and he tells this story about how he was the subject of a Jerry Seinfeld show, and that day he was driving into work, and at that time he was a prosecutor in New York, and he was driving to the courthouse, and he gets people on the street go, I saw you on Jerry Seinfeld. No, I wasn't actually on Jerry Seinfeld. So he goes into the courthouse. Everyone, I saw you on Jerry Seinfeld. He goes into the courtroom, and the defendant is sitting at the table. The defendant looks at him and said, hey, you were on Jerry Seinfeld last night. No, I wasn't on Jerry Seinfeld. I wasn't. And the guy said, the guy couldn't even pass law school the first time, and now he can't even act. So it was a great story. And I have one more very touching part to the story, if you don't mind.
Yeah, let's go over it.
Well, again, he was a very humble person, and the rest of this story is that Jay, on the night that he introduced JFK Jr., right after he introduced JFK, and now please welcome our mystery guest, John Kennedy Jr. And the moment Kennedy came out on stage, Jay had this vision going back to the funeral procession for his father, who had been assassinated. And the funeral procession where you saw JFK Jr. in his little sailor outfit saluting his dad's casket. I don't know if you remember that video.
Yeah, I remember seeing that video because JFK was assassinated about 9 years before I was born. But I remember seeing the footage. And
No, I know that, yeah. But anyway, during the funeral procession, his mother, Jackie Kennedy, had dressed him in a little sailor outfit, and he saluted the casket as a horse-driven casket as his father went by. And it was very, very touching. And Jay said he had this memory flash into his head. He was in the living room watching it with his mom, who burst into tears. She said, "What's going to happen to that poor little boy? What's going to happen to him?" And he tried to console his mom. Mom, he'll be okay. I promise you, he'll be okay. But he couldn't do anything. His mom was just crying out of control. And he remembered how helpless he felt. Well, here's JFK Jr. coming out on stage, coming and sitting down next to him, and he's at the point where he's almost bursting out into tears because that's the memory that came into his head. So anyway,
Wow.
It was a very successful appearance, and guess who his biggest fan was while he was on?
Seinfeld.
Seinfeld was fascinated with him. And the two of them had an incredible rapport because he was a big fan of Seinfeld. And it was like our, I don't know, second highest rated show. It was an incredible show.
Wow. Yeah, I remember Warren Eckstein, the pet show host, he was represented by Weston Shapiro, which represented Jerry along with several other members of the Seinfeld cast. And Warren said Jerry is just the nicest guy.
Yes, and he and Jay were close friends. I mean, they worked all the comedy clubs in Los Angeles before they got big.
I remember Seinfeld first back in the early 80s. He was on, I think, about 6 episodes of Benson as this comedy writer named Frankie. It was during the 80 to 81 season. And but then one day he was suddenly gone from the show. I think it was a contract dispute or something. I'd completely forgotten about it. And then years later, they said, yeah, Seinfeld played Frankie on Benson. It's like, it gave me instant recalls like, Frankie, whatever happened to that guy anyway? Now I know.
Yes.
Now, you said there was one other person besides JFK Jr.
Well, it was John Glenn.
John Glenn, yeah.
And as you pointed out, not only was he the first person to orbit the Earth, but he went on to become a prominent United States senator from Ohio and a prominent presidential candidate. Well, but he also became the oldest person to have gone up in the space shuttle.
That's right, yeah. I think it was 90 years old at the time.
Yeah. And so Jay said, why don't we book John Glenn? And I said, but Jay, we never booked him. We've never booked him. Why would you want to book him now? And he said, well, oldest guy to go up into outer space in the space shuttle. Yeah, let's do it. Well, what Jay wasn't telling me at the time is that there was a whole backstory here. When Jay was in 5th grade, his teacher assigned the class to write an essay about the incident. John Glenn, being the first person to orbit the Earth, and his teacher, I think it was his 5th grade teacher, assigned Jay to do an essay, and he didn't really do a good job, and Jay got a C- on it. For substandard and incomplete work. So I didn't know this story, right? And I couldn't figure out why Jay wanted me to book John Glenn. And not only did he say, why don't we book John Glenn, he kept coming to my office and saying, how are we doing with John Glenn? I said, well, these things take time. You don't just book somebody in an hour. He goes, okay. And then he just kept coming to my office every day. What's going on with John Glenn? So I went down to his assistant, Helga, and I said, why is Jay into John Glenn? And she said, oh, it's because his teacher, Mr. Simon, he had gotten in touch with Mr. Simon, got in touch with him, and he wants to impress his teacher. I think, seriously? So
wow.
Anyway, I booked John Glenn, and then he starts talking on the air. He said, "We can't wait. We're going to have John Glenn on, and I wrote this paper in fifth grade, and I just talked to my teacher, Mr. Simon, the other day. He's still teaching there, and Mr. Simon promised me that if I had John Glenn on and I did a good job, he would give me an A on the paper." Are you really saying this on the air? So John Glenn comes on. He, does a wonderful job. Jay, who couldn't have been more interested in his, is originally orbiting around the Earth, but his story about going up on the space shuttle and everything. And after the show, I said, "You did a nice job." He said, yeah, I got to go call Mr. Simon. So he was thrilled to death. The next day he gets on the show and he said, "Mr. Simon gave me an A." So anyway, that was also Jay's favorite guest.
I remember back in 2010, or actually 2009, is when the Tonight Show went to Conan O'Brien for about, I think, 7 or 8 months. And then Leno got prime time from 10 to 11 p.m. I was listening to an interview that Leno recently did with Bill Maher on his podcast show online. And he talked about how NBC just made a whole mess of things. Just what was, for you, how much just craziness was there just trying to, match everything up what was going on? Because it was just, I don't know, just mayhem seemed to ensue there too. And just how were you able to right the ship and, get things back to order after that whole, debacle by the NBC network itself?
I don't think we ever really recovered from it. I mean, we did technically in terms of, bringing the ratings back, but we never really recovered from that incident because Jay was portrayed as the bad guy. But what actually happened is the president of NBC, Jeff Zucker at the time, some people may remember that name from CNN. After he had, ruined NBC with his programming decisions, he went on and did the same thing at CNN. But other than that, I like Jeff. So Jeff Zucker, who was a very hands-on kind of a guy, he worked out of New York, but he would come in, he was very likable. He would come in and talk to the writers and producers. Whenever he came out to Burbank, he would make it a point to come and visit with the writers and producers and just say, "What can I do to help you guys? Is there anything I can do to help? Is there any guests you want to get that I can maybe pull some strings, make it happen?" He was that kind of a guy. He came one day, we had a glass enclosed room, the writers and producers, and here's Jeff Zucker, and he walks right past our room, straight down to where Jay's office is. Then 15 minutes later, he walks past us again, never comes in, and it's like, something is wrong. Then Jay came in the writer's room, and we said, what was going on with you and Jeff? And he said, "Oh, Jeff just fired me." What? Yeah, Jeff gave me 5 years. He said I can have the show for 5 years, and then he's going to give the job to Conan, and he had no other choice but because Conan was playing hardball, and he was going to leave NBC unless he got the job. And it's like, well, Jay, where's Conan going to go? Who's going to take Conan? They had Letterman's on CBS. Kimmelman's on ABC. Where's Conan going to go? And he said, once they tell you they don't want you, there's not a lot you can do. So he seemed to be resigned to his fate. And he had even talked to Zucker and said, Jeff, I'm number one in the ratings. Remember, once we became number one in 1995, we never turned around. We always were number one in the ratings. He said, Jeff, let's make a deal. How about you keep me on the air as long as I'm number one, and the day I become number two, then you can do with me what you want. And Zucker said, no, sorry, already signed the contract.
Mm.
The deal was already done. So as time went on, this started bothering Jay more and more because our ratings just kept doing well. We just kept doing great. So Jay starts doing these jokes about NBC, about, they're not so great in the program, and Zucker jokes, and they were actually pretty funny.
I remember those, yeah. I one in particular, Barack Obama's ratings are down to 39%, but look on the bright side, it's still more popular than NBC.
Exactly, and he would do those jokes regularly, and they were always really good, and he meant them, He was
yeah. Well, Carson used to make fun of NBC back in the day, back in the mid-'70s to mid-'80s when he says, NBC stands for 19 bombs canceled, folks.
Right. He did it too. That's right. And I think Jay was maybe drawing upon, those days when Johnny.
Oh, yeah.
But Jay had always had this sort of, I'm loyal to NBC. But I think he just, he couldn't help himself.
I'm Josh Jacobs, and this is the Talking Archive. We're in conversation with Dave Berg, longtime producer of The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. He's got a book, by the way, called Behind the Curtain, an inside look at Jay Leno's Tonight Show, and it's available online for purchase at Amazon.com and other online retailers. And next time, we're going to be discussing what happened when Conan O'Brien took over The Tonight Show back in 2009, as well as what Dave's up to now, including a film that's coming up next year that I think a lot of people will be interested in seeing.